Okay, so let's unpack this one. We're diving into, well, a really unique bit of history today, exploring this figure, the sin eater, who sort of existed right on the fringes, doing something that sounds almost, yeah, like something from a dark fairy tale.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The source we're digging into here is an article from Historic Mysteries called Medieval Sin Eaters, Defying Damnation for a Loaf of Bread. I mean, that title alone tells you a lot about the strangeness of it all.
Exactly. So our mission, for this deep dive is to really pull out the key stuff from this article. We want to understand who these sin eaters actually were, what this really bizarre ritual involved, why people back then genuinely thought it worked, and what it all tells us about medieval society, their beliefs, their fears about sin, and, well, death itself.
Yeah, and it's such a paradox, this role, providing something people desperately needed in a crisis, but being completely shunned for it.
Right. It's fascinating. So to get our heads around it, we need the context. What was life like back then in medieval Europe, especially regarding sin?
Well, you have to imagine the church was incredibly powerful, and the fear of eternal damnation. That wasn't just some abstract idea. It was a terrifying everyday reality, like woven into the fabric of life.
Yeah, everything you did, maybe everything you even thought, felt like it was being judged.
Constantly judged, yeah, against this divine standard.
And just, well, living day to day must have meant you racked up sins. Maybe even more if you're wealthy.
Oh, yeah, right.
More opportunities for missteps.
Oh, absolutely. It must have felt incredibly hard, maybe even impossible, to get through life without building up this huge spiritual debt, as you put it.
So people were looking for ways to deal with that.
That's the feeling, yes. This intense fear, combined with the church's, let's say, strict rules, it led to all sorts of, well, cottage industries almost popping up. Things like buying indulgences.
Paying the church to reduce punishment for sins.
Exactly. A kind of spiritual marketplace.
And the sin eater. That seems like another response, but totally outside the official system.
Completely outside. The article presents it as a different way. Yeah, much more visceral, more literal, maybe, to handle that burden of sin.
So how does the article actually define them? Who was a sin eater?
Fundamentally, they were individuals, usually quite poor, often marginalized, who performed a very specific ritual. This was usually done at the deathbed or maybe at the wake.
And the belief was
Yeah.
that they took the sins away.
Literally, yes. The core belief was that this ritual transferred the dead person's sins onto the sin eater.
So the goal was just to kind of clear the path for the soul.
That's it, precisely, to make sure the soul could leave this world, free from the weight of its sins, get to the afterlife unburdened, hopefully skip purgatory or avoid hell altogether.
Okay, where did this specific and, let's face it, pretty weird practice come from?
Well, it's mostly associated with the British Isles, England, Wales, Scotland, during the medieval period, broadly speaking. But it's tricky.
Tricky how?
The actual written records we have are surprisingly late, mostly 17th century, but the article strongly suggests the custom itself is probably much, much older.
Older. Like pre-Christian, maybe.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Roots in older folk beliefs, perhaps pagan traditions, that then got kind of tangled up with local Christian practices.
So it wasn't approved by the church, but it happened anyway.
Exactly. The official church didn't like it, but it persisted. It's a great example of how these older folk beliefs blended with Christianity during that long transition period, especially in those areas, England, Wales, Scotland. That's where it seemed most common.
Okay, right. This is where it gets really interesting for me. The ritual.
Mm-hmm.
What did they actually do? You said it was simple.
It was incredibly simple, almost starkly symbolic. So when someone died, the family would place a loaf of bread right on the chest of the body.
Just bread.
Usually bread. Sometimes the article mentions maybe a bowl of ale or beer, and a small coin might be included too.
And then they'd call for the sin eater from the edge of town, you said.
Yes, exactly. They'd be summoned, often lived apart, on the fringes, and their job was just, well, to come, eat that bread, drink the ale if it was there, and take the coin.
And just by eating the bread, they ate the sins.
That was the absolute core belief. The bread, sitting there on the corpse, was thought to have soaked up, absorbed the deceased person's sins. So by eating it, the sin eater symbolically, and people believed literally, took those sins into their own body.
Wow.
Transferred them away from the dead person. And that act supposedly purified the departed soul, made it ready for its journey.
That is quite something. But what a terrible burden for the sin eater, right? taking on everyone else's spiritual baggage.
Oh, absolutely. It was seen as an incredibly dangerous job, not physically, but spiritually polluting. They were risking their own immortal soul, basically.
And all for what? A bit of bread and maybe a coin.
Pretty much a meal, essentially, which tells you something about their likely poverty.
Yeah. No wonder they were social outcasts.
Complete pariahs,
Wow.
often. Forced to live on the margins, avoided, even feared by the very community they served.
That's the paradox you mentioned.
It really is. You provide this crucial, deeply needed service at a moment of intense fear and grief. But the act itself makes you repulsive in daily life. People needed the ritual for their dead loved ones.
But then couldn't bear to be near the person who performed it.
Exactly that. It's fascinatingly bleak, and yet you can see the appeal for the grieving family, can't you? It offered something tangible, a physical act promising absolution. Maybe something the more formal, sometimes distant church doctrines didn't feel like they provided in the same immediate way.
A kind of folk comfort.
A folk comfort, exactly. A grassroots spiritual solution almost.
So how did the official church view this? Were they trying to stamp it out?
Well, officially they denounced it. Definitely. It wasn't a sacrament. It smacked of superstition, maybe those pagan roots you mentioned. But the article points out there seems to have been a kind of quiet tolerance often. You can imagine local priests maybe not wanting to stir up trouble by forbidding a deeply ingrained custom that clearly brought comfort, however unorthodox.
Easier to just look the other way sometimes.
Probably. Denounce it formally, perhaps, but let it happen in practice, especially in more remote areas.
It really makes you wonder, who were these people? Who would choose that life? Voluntarily cutting yourself off, taking on sins. Why?
It's a huge question. The article touches on possibilities. For some, sheer poverty, as we said. The bread and coin meant survival. For others, maybe a genuine, if perhaps warped, belief that they were performing a necessary service, even at personal cost.
Or maybe personal tragedy played a part, like that story, Richard Munslow.
Yes, that's a really powerful anecdote mentioned in the source. Richard Munslow, apparently a reasonably well-off farmer, not the usual profile. But in 1870, he suffered an appalling tragedy, lost 3 of his children to scarlet fever, all within about a week.
Oh, terrible. And after that, he became a sin eater.
That's the story, yes. Why? Well, we can only speculate, can't we? The article suggests maybe it was a form of penance. Did he feel responsible somehow for his own sins causing the tragedy?
Or maybe just trying to save other souls, having failed to save his own children.
Perhaps. A desperate act of devotion or service. We don't know. But the article notes he apparently continued as a sin eater for the rest of his life until he died in 1906. It's a really striking, sad glimpse into what might drive someone to that role.
So this practice, it clearly existed for a long time, centuries maybe, but it eventually died out. What happened?
Well, several big shifts really did it in. Firstly, the Reformation. The rise of Protestantism changed everything for a lot of people regarding faith and sin.
More focus on direct repentance to God.
Exactly. Less need or acceptance of intermediaries like priests, let alone sin eaters. The whole framework shifted for many.
And then I suppose the Enlightenment finished it off.
Pretty much, yeah. The Age of Reason. Increasing focus on science, rationality, skepticism. It just eroded the belief systems that supported things like symbolic rituals. Sin eating started to look like pure superstition.
The world was just changing too much.
The intellectual and religious climate changed fundamentally, so the practice faded.
By the 19th century, it was mostly gone.
Largely gone, yes. The article suggests it clung on longest in really remote rural areas where old traditions always linger. But eventually, yeah, under the weight of religious change and a more modern worldview, it just disappeared.
So if we step back from the details,
Yeah.
what does this really obscure figure, the sin eater, actually tell us? What's the legacy here?
I think their legacy, strange as it is really a testament to how societies grapple with the big stuff, sin, death, the afterlife, those huge, enduring human questions.
It definitely speaks to that deep need we seem to have to find peace, find redemption, somehow cleanse the slate at the end of life.
Absolutely. The practice itself, however alien it seems to us now, it just shows the lengths people will go to create meaning, find some kind of comfort when faced with death. It's one cultural response to that universal fear and mystery.
And they occupied this really specific, necessary, but as we said, despised niche, sort of caught between ancient folk beliefs and the newer Christian framework.
Right. And even though the practice is long gone, the figure of the sin eater, it still captures the imagination, doesn't it? It kind of stands as this haunting symbol of our long, complex quest to make sense of mortality.
Yeah. Their story, it's not just some historical oddity, as the article implies. It really reflects those deep human fears and hopes about death. It reminds you of the really complex, sometimes, frankly, bizarre ways cultures have tried to reconcile themselves with that finality.
It forces you to think about the whole mindset, the whole web of belief and fear that can make such a practice seem not just possible, but necessary for people.
Yeah. And it leaves you thinking about those questions the article itself raises at the end, questions that really cut deep.
Hmm.
Would you actually employ someone like that, a total outcast, at the end of a loved one's life?
Mm.
Could you truly believe that their soul's passage could be bought, secured for just a piece of bread, some beer, and a coin? What does believing that say about their world? Or maybe even about the things we still hope for or fear in ours?
Mm.
Definitely something to mull over.